My name is Jay Clark. I'm an AI/ML specialist here at AWS. And in this video, I'm going to take you through a quick example of using large language models, so specifically models on Bedrock, to generate creative work, and in this case, novels or complete books. So a bit of background, this is going to be pretty short, but the original idea was you see lots of examples showing how you can use generative models to summarize or to translate style or to generate a single page report, marketing, whatever the case may be. But you see less examples of using models to sort of generate longer content, right, of the order of hundreds of pages. And this has always been of interest to me. And so I set about trying to come up with a case where we could generate hundreds of pages, have it keep consistency, do it in a reliable and repeatable way. And so that's the example here. It's not complete in that you would deploy this tomorrow, but it's complete enough that we can sort of generate books. I'll show you all the process that we go through. And then in the end, you have a complete work, a complete novel. So a bit of background. I attempted this before in sort of an initial version. So back when we had sort of Claude version 2 or so. And the idea was to take an iterative approach. So these models just aren't, I don't think they'll ever reliably be able to generate many pages in one go. They'll always start to trail off, or they'll just stop generating after a certain amount. It's sort of a problem I don't see going away, at least anytime soon. So I thought to myself, this is probably going to be an iterative approach. And that was the initial thought I had, was how would I write a book with a model? And the original process was, well, first we need some sort of seed. So I need to provide a story prompt. And from that story prompt, then I can just iteratively create pages or generate pages. So this is maybe the next iteration of that. And I'll show what this looks like. But essentially, I'm going to use a series of prompts that I think there are like 10 or so prompts that I'm going to use. And then I'm going to have a loop of generating all the content I need for the story. So I'll run through it step by step. It sort of starts, if you're looking at the screen, in the prompt section. And then we get to where we're actually building the story. And then we finally get to where we're finishing the story. So what do these prompts look like? And if you look here, there's sort of this there's a 3-arc follow-up, there's characters, there's chapters, there's background, and then there's scene generation. And I think from a high level, you probably get what these look like or what these are aimed to do. But as a sort of first step, we're aiming to create the overall structure of the story. So we're essentially going to get the beginning to end of the story in arcs. And here's the prompt for this. The key features being, there's a system tag that's the system instruction. There's also a user tag that's the user instruction, and then there's an assistant tag that's the assistant instructions or starting of what the model is going to output. And I'll talk about them a little bit, and I'll skim through the others. But you're an AI novelist, so common boilerplate, and then I'm giving the instructions on what you're going to do, who's the heroes, and who might oppose them, what are these people trying to do, etc. All the stuff you might want to keep in mind when coming up with an idea for a story or a sort of single pager for a story. Here's what you want to keep in mind. A story is usually someone trying to do something or prevent something. Keep in mind characters. All good fiction comes down to characters. So a lot of this stuff, and nothing, I don't think, too surprising, but something that if a human were attempting to do this, we certainly want to keep in mind, and we want the model to keep that in mind as well. And so now we get back down to what the user's actually passing in. And in this case, it's fairly straightforward. You're passing in, and the double bracketed text is just a variable that I'll add in. But here I'm passing in a story prompt. And so the story prompt can be as verbose as you'd like, or as short as you'd like. So you may just give a sentence summary for the story, or you may give an entire paragraph or an entire page for the story. But just whatever detail you give, the model is aiming to read the above story prompt and write a 3-act narrative around it, and it has its instructions on what a 3-act narrative consists of. Finally, something that you'll see in all of these prompts is what my format needs to be on the output. So in all of these things, and especially in sort of successive calls to a model, I need formatted output. And when I was sort of experimenting with this, originally my usual preference is to default towards JSON, right? So output JSON because it's just the easiest machine readable structured thing I can think of. Uh, from there, if that doesn't work, I generally will look at XML, although I don't love that because sometimes models will sort of go off the rails and start adding nested trees that you wouldn't have expected, and it's a bit harder to parse those. But here, what I found is that JSON didn't work. But when thinking about that, this is just text, I sort of came to the conclusion that actually, if I'm just generating some of this background information, I want it to be formatted, but I don't necessarily need it to be structured. And so that's where it came sort of settled on Markdown. And maybe in the future I might change that to something like HTML, which might be a bit more difficult to parse, but more structured in that it'd be easier to parse certain features. But for now, it's Markdown, and you'll see this in a ton of places where I'll say I'll put it in Markdown tags. And then finally, the assistant portion, and this is maybe even the most important piece, is that to ensure consistency in what the model puts out. So almost regardless of what you put in, I need to ensure that the model's going to output something machine readable because I want this to essentially be automated. Now, this doesn't mean you couldn't add in places, user feedback, and you're sort of expected to, but at least for us, I need to ensure that this thing could run in an automated fashion. And so that's where you see this response portion. And all this response really is, and I'll show it further down, but it's just what I want the model to start with, or what I want the model to think it started with, right? So putting words in the model's mouth. So what this usually looks like is just Markdown /n and then a title or a heading 1 tag. And then the model just generates from there. And what's good about this is that I can ensure at least it has started the Markdown tag, and it's more likely to then place the closing Markdown tag. So I know regardless of what it generates, I have Markdown tags in between it, and then from there I can do my parsing and exploration. But this is for the 3x structure, and some pieces that aren't terribly important but are worth mentioning because they may look different is that you'll see I'm using sort of a prompt template, and if I scroll up a bit more, you'll see I'm using a model config and a Bedrock client. So these are sort of my experimental APIs or wrappers around Boto 3. So it's nothing that you couldn't do with sort of just the Boto 3 calls, but just for cleanliness and and logging, I'm going to be using a prompt template and a Bedrock client. Oh, and also just a bit on the models. So here's where I instantiate the Bedrock client, but I'll have a model config. All that is just a model ID, right? So it might be something like Claude 3.5 Sonnet, as well as max tokens and a temperature. So nothing fancy. And if you've used any of the large language model or generative AI libraries, you're probably familiar with that. And if not, just know this is just what the model is, and these are the parameters that go to the model. Okay, I'll show maybe one more and then just start going to where things are actually generated. But the next step, and so this is all sequential. So the next step, well, I guess it's technically a follow-up. So a chance so the model will produce a draft 3-arc, or 3-act, sorry. I'll call it page or narrative for the story. And from there, you have your chance to follow up. So to provide any feedback that you might like. And so again, this is the follow-up text. So you're an AI novelist helping all blah, blah, blah. Your current task is to shape a 3-act narrative by adding compelling creative plot lines. And then there's just some slightly different instructions because it's doing something slightly different. It's finishing as opposed to creating from scratch. And so what you get is whatever the story acts were that were generated previously, and then from there you get the corrective notes. So anything that a user provides of, hey, I want this to happen in the third act, or I want this to not happen there. And then finally, so again, always markdown document, and then always three act, always the start of a response. Okay, the final piece that I'll add is I'll just sort of bring it up here just to say, from there we generate a full cast of characters, because again, we're generating all the information that we want the model to be aware of when it starts actually generating pages or actually generating scenes. And so we start with the characters. So now you've created the 3 acts. Now you're going to create the full cast of characters. Once you've created the full cast of characters, the next step is to give a fuller description of what's going to happen in the story. So now that we have the 3-act narrative, now that we have all the characters that we can use, we can go through and actually write chapters. And so when I say write chapters, I mean define the chapters and what's going to happen in them. And so let's see if I have an example here. Yeah, the example is essentially, so we have a title, that's great. We have sort of the act, so the first act, and then we have chapter 1, and then the scene and the number of pages. Now, this number of pages is important, and so here's where we get to some of the practical applications or practical requirements of this. When using a model to sort of generate a scene, if you don't give it additional instruction, it will just sort of generate about a page of text. Well, that's great if you're just trying to generate one thing, but if you're trying to actually generate a larger novel, so something that may be hundreds of pages as opposed to a couple of pages, that scene may be 5, right? So that this is something is happening. It is a description of a place, a description of a person, an interaction between two people, or some sort of conflict happening. That's not just going to be contained in a single page. In most cases, it's going to be multiple pages. So by forcing the model to give the number of pages that's expected there, we add a bit of instruction, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, and that it needs to generate more text when it finally goes to generate that scene. So that this was an important piece that I didn't have originally, and it sort of didn't work before. And one thing that I noted sort of in some of the earlier processes are that if you don't have those number of pages, the model will just sort of happily skip through all of your scenes to the end very quickly. Right, so before, instead of having the actual scene that was being generated, it was more of a page by page. So you define the chapter, maybe give a paragraph on what's supposed to happen in the chapter, and then that's passed to the model. And so the model will page by page generate what's going to happen. Well, in those cases, or in those tests, the model actually just skipped forward. It didn't really pay attention to the chapters. It hit the marks, but it would sort of very quickly progress through. So it might start in what's here, scene 1, but end up in chapter 5, scene 2 on the next page, and then chapter 10 on the page following that, and until it essentially had ended the story after 10 pages, almost regardless of how much structure had been set up and how much instruction you've given it on how many pages it should take. Solution to that, essentially have well-defined scenes and have well-defined pages that the scene should take place on. So that's the chapters. There can be a follow-up section. I didn't actually implement this. This is more of a to do. And then maybe finally is the background. So if we imagine when we're writing a book, and it could be fiction, could be nonfiction, it actually doesn't matter in this case. There's a point of research where you're going to want a lot of background information on what's happening. It may be as simple as what was going on during the time of this piece. It may be you creating lore or narrative around what might not explicitly come through in the book or in the novel, but is necessary background for at least the model or the writer to understand the place, to understand the place, to understand the relationships between characters, to understand the relationships between the space, between the narrative. And so this was actually a really important piece where I just asked this model to come up with needed background information. So it already has the three acts, it already has the characters, it already has the chapters. Now what it can do is come up with, well, what's the background on the location, right? So it's in a small milling town. Lots of jobs have been outsourced. A lot of this that don't make it necessarily directly into the story, but can be a sort of subplot or sub narrative in that story around, well, there's lots of people available because there are no jobs here now. And it is still on the writer to sort of make all of that make sense, but having that background information explicitly available is really important, and really does change the quality of the writing that's produced. And ah so then we get to the actual scene generation step, and I'll save these. Well, I will just show this here, but just to say, this generates this prompt. So essentially, what this is going to do is then come up with a chapter. So now it's chapter one. Here's chapter one. Here's the scene, or here are the scenes. Here's how many pages they should have. Here's a paragraph about what's going to happen, and this will be part of the iterative approach. In that, if we try to generate everything, again, these models aren't and might not ever be really adept at generating long portions of text. So if I wanted it to generate sort of a full story in one swoop, that would not work out well, and has not worked out well in the past. But in this case, if I just loop through, I know the number of chapters. For chapter one, generate something detailed and that fits the story, it can do that. And then once I get to the next chapter, I can even pass in the previous chapter as information for the next. And so in that way, I can try and maintain that context, I can maintain that continuity, but also ensure that there's a consistency and a quality in the narration generated or narrative generated. So let's get into it, and I'll talk about the critics in a second as well. But let's then jump into the story builder portion. Maybe I'll go to the configuration first. So again, all of this starts with the three acts. You provide a story prompt, and then that story prompt is passed to the model to come up with three acts. And I've pre-ran one of these through. I think it's the last one on mystery thriller, right? A small town detective investigates a series of break-ins where nothing's stolen. Instead, the intruder leaves objects behind, and they relate to a cold case. Okay. And so here's the story prompt I'm going to pass in. I just have some different genres when I was testing this out. Now let's talk about this for a second. The personality, and another issue. So this maybe goes to the practical portion. Another issue I ran into when trying to get these models to generate creative work is that it was pretty bland. It was pretty bland and of low quality and low level of writing. So everything just sort of comes out as young adult fiction. It's good if you're trying to actually write young adult fiction. Not so great if you want sort of an adult fully fleshed out novel. I tried a couple of different prompt engineering techniques to try and get this to generate more complex pieces, and they worked to a certain extent, but on the whole, just sort of didn't. And so until I sort of stumbled onto, well, let's say I were to give it someone to sort of base this on. So in this case, you see a personality written in the style of Ernest Hemingway. And given it this, did substantively change the quality of the writing. And we know models are great at sort of taking a style that you've given them, right? So write in the style of person X or of something else, and they are really good at that, right? There's sort of the three things they're good at: summarizing, changing style, and sort of what I'll call translating. But take this text and turn it into code or something like that, or go from English to Spanish, etc. Now, I also tried distilling the personality. I'm using sort of air quotes there. The personality of these writers to you know to try and sort of use text descriptions as opposed to just saying this person, that did not work as well. It sort of didn't work at all. The difference between sort of trying to distill Ernest Hemingway down into sentences didn't produce nearly the quality of writing that just saying written in the style of Ernest Hemingway, and was much easier to say there. I'm still looking for ways to sort of get around that, but it seems like one of the fundamental pieces of training, right? There's an understanding of Ernest Hemingway in these models that don't lend themselves well to being explicitly produced. We'll see how that goes. But in this case, so I have a personality here. There's a personality added to the end of the story prompt, right? So because it's not just what the story is, it's whatever instructions you want to give it. So great. What does this actually produce? So I look at here, I'm just calling the Bedrock client and passing in my model and passing in my variables, right? Nothing fancy there. I won't spend a ton of time there. But now let's print it all out. So first we have the markdown tags. So here's the title, the things left behind. We have core elements, genre, hero, antagonist, settings, Millsbrook main. Oh, declining paper mill. Maybe that's why I said mill in one of the earlier examples. I'm sort of recalling this. And then we have the 3-act structure. So first is the setup. Sarah investigates break-ins where mysterious objects appear, right? And it goes through so that list of things that should happen in the first act. We have the second act around confrontation. Investigation reveals the original case was deliberately mishandled. We have our resolution, so what's going to happen in the third act, and we have that here. But in addition, we have some other pieces that it's important for the model to know. All right, so thematic elements, exploration of collective guilt in small communities, the cost of truth versus preservation of social order, narrative complications. Sarah's teenage daughter begins receiving threatening messages. Town's economic dependence on both parties creates ethical dilemmas, right? So a lot of this that's useful to keep in mind when the model's actually writing the book. And so a lot of this background is super useful. So now we get to the next step, which is around updating that. So the way I have been using this is essentially I have some corrective notes. There's a personality again. So again, I keep refreshing that Ernest Hemingway is your guide. Also one that added a bit of realism, although maybe it's debatable how real that is. Life is pain and suffering, and the novel should reflect that. Was just going to these models also really love to paint a rosy picture, but that's not always what you want in novels, right? There has to be some, or has to be, you may want some notion of danger, some notion of failure that sometimes comes up in these, and so this is one way I've tried to include that. Let's see how well it works. But from here, I'm now get the updated act. So again, it's using the previous act. So a lot of this, I think you'll find the same. Let me see if I can find a good difference. So truth is a bullet. Once fired, you can't control who it kills. Small towns don't keep secrets, they become them. Enhanced complications. And these drawings reveal memories of things you shouldn't know. Okay, so maybe a bit more narrative license here. Let me quickly scroll down the characters because I want to get to the sort of scene generation portion, because I think that's maybe a more interesting piece than some of these as well. So okay, now we come up with our primary character. So Sarah Winters, who was already mentioned above, but now we get sort of her full backstory. Her physical attributes: weather face, prematurely gray hair, perpetually tired eyes. Psychology, post-traumatic stress, high-functioning alcoholic. Wow, okay. Maybe another note here, and I'm still working on this, is the creative and new quality of what the models generate. And what I have found is that the models really like certain qualities in their characters or in their storytelling. So the certain names, certain types appear all the time, and I haven't been able to stop it yet. So being an alcoholic for a detective is something that shows up a ton, or the certain names like Miller, Blacksworth, these sorts of things just come up time and time again. And maybe I only notice it because I've run this so many times, but it is a case where you'll probably want to add your own detail to ensure that there's something creative there. So just a note. But again, core drive, need to atone for failing to see signs when children disappeared, internal conflict, struggles between maternal instincts and pursuit of justice. Okay, a lot of great stuff. Relationships, widow to David and Spirit, mother to Emily, divorced from James. And okay, so we get a bit of background on our primary characters. We have our secondary characters here. James Winters. Okay, we have supporting characters and then minor but significant characters. And we get a bit less detail in each of them as it goes on. This is just someone from the sort of character bank that the model can pull from sort of anytime it deems it necessary. District attorney, okay, great. Now I'll just show background. I won't talk too much about it, but Millsbrook, Maine, town profile. Population is this, and it's declining. Useful things that might not show up directly in the narrative, but are useful to know. Harsh winters, brief summers. 27% unemployment. I don't know that actually will ever show up, but historical timeline. So Millsbrook Paper Mill is founded in 1891, etc., etc. We sort of go down this list. These are important pieces, not necessarily all of them, but for the narrative to pull from. And now we get to the generation loop. And so here's maybe the most complicated piece, but the sort of most important piece as well, right? We're actually generating the story. And the way this is done, there are actually two loops. And if you look here at sort of very specific things that I'll highlight, there's this sort of loop through chapters. And this was sort of really important because if I, previously, again, I said I started by just generating page by page. That didn't work. It actually ended the story too quickly. Well, once I had scenes and asked it to generate scene by scene, that worked, but it actually skipped through chapters pretty quickly. Where I've currently ended on or resting on is if I take a chapter and I generate through each scene, or take a loop through each scene and generate it as I go. And that's been the most consistent, at least so far. So what I do is I essentially get the chapter, I generate what the chapter should hold, right? And here's all the background information that's given. So the story acts, the characters, the chapter arcs, the background, the novel so far, the current chapter, and then how I want that to start. So there's a lot of background information given, or a lot of context given, and then I just ask it to generate this for the next chapter. And so it'll generate a scene list for the chapter. I'll show what that looks like, and then we go to the next step, and there's actually another loop. And this loop, and sort of maybe it's implied, but for the chapter that's currently in, we're now going to generate each scene. And so that's what happens in this chapter. So we'll generate each scene in the chapter, then close out the chapter. And so this way the model can't go too fast because it can't go to the next chapter. And it sort of is forced to sort of sit in the chapter where it is and give you a full narrative. And so this has been the most consistent in terms of number of pages. One of the variables at the chapter level was just an estimated number of pages. And I've been able to get this to consistently generate on the order of 200, 300 pages. Whereas, in previous attempts, I was maybe on the order of 10 to 20 page stories. So now I'm at 200. I could probably push that to about 500. And then maybe a goal in the future might be something around 1,000. But again, and we'll talk about this when we look at the story finisher. How will I know that I've generated a cohesive, coherent 1,000-page story? That I can't just read these read these drafts at every turn. So we'll get to talk about that. I can sort of spot check and then run through about a 200-page story pretty easily, so I know I can do that consistently. So what does this generation look like? And you may see here there's a scene notes generation as well, but we'll look at what that seems like. So here's the output from the loop. I won't go through all of this, just a bit of it to show you what's happening. So first I have chapter 1. Here's the scene. The scene has chapters. It also has the number of pages that are supposed to be there. Sarah Winters arrives at a routine break-in, blah, 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 and there's just a paragraph about what happens in the scene. Next, I have my scene 2. These are 4 pages. Here's what happens in that scene, and then I have scene 3. So for chapter 1, here are the 3 scenes that it needs to write. So now I break into my second loop, and my second loop generates the actual scene. But first, to keep the model on track further, I actually generate a recommendation for the scene itself. So this, what you're seeing here in this markdown, is actually the recommendation for what happens on scene 1, or scene 1, chapter 1. So since it's the opening of the scene, so what's happened so far? So since this is the opening scene of the novel, there are no prior narratives. Okay, that's great. It's the first one. What's the recommendation for the rest of the chapter? So in chapter 1, here's what I want to happen. What's the recommendation for what should happen on this page? And then for this page, focus on these things. And so this recommendation, let's see how far it goes. Here we go. In the scene with Sarah bagging the mitten as evidence. So this scene is the recommendation now passed to the actual model to generate an actual scene. And that recommendation was needed. Now that recommendation could be user provided, right? So a user could provide what they want to happen in the scene. Here it's model generated, essentially the same thing, right? But within this, I now generate the scene. There's a pages given, and then we see the text produced. Right, so the break-in routine, broken glass and old hardwood, et cetera, et cetera. We scroll down. But there's nothing standard about a 15-year-old mitten appearing like a dead bird after a storm, blah, 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 blah. It was backed up. So the scene ended the way it was recommended. The scene began the way it was. And if you were to read all through this, you'd say, okay, this matched the scene pretty well. Another practical implementation piece, this pages. So no matter how much information I gave, the model would generate as much text as it wanted to generate. Whether the scene said it should have 1 page or 5, it would generate however much text it wanted to. One trick that I've found effective in sort of getting it to more closely match the number of pages I'm expecting is to actually have the model write first. So it writes the sort of scene tag. Next, it writes the number of pages that it's going to produce, essentially sort of trying to enforce the fact that it's going to write this many pages, and it loves to maintain its consistency, and so it's more likely to generate that many pages. A small thing that has had an outsized impact in sort of the amount of text produced in the story. Okay. So we go through this, we've generated scene 1. Now we go back through that alternating approach. So here is the recommendation for scene 2. So since we know what's happened so far, so now we get what's happened so far. We get the recommendation for the rest of the chapter. Again, that always stays present. And now the remaining scenes to focus on, the recommendation for what should happen on this page. For scene 2, blah, 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 blah. And we go down that list. So those are the recommendations. They're passed in. And now we get scene 2, which is 4 pages for this. Sarah sat at her kitchen. We go all the way down. She reached for the bottle again, but her hand stopped halfway. Et cetera, et cetera. And we alternate in that way until we've written all of the scenes for that chapter. Right. And so we have our scene 3, and there were 3 scenes in this chapter. So we have the scene. I won't spend too much time here, but it's there. Now we break out of that loop and start the next chapter. And so in this chapter, we generate what should happen in this chapter based on what we had in our original plan, but not just that, right? Because now we have updated information. So what's happened so far in the novel? And so it generates these based on that information. So you get something that's slightly more consistent. And so we have, here's what's happened in scenes 1, scene 2, scene 3. Great. You may note this text somewhere just saying I was making lots of calls to models, as might be present here. At some point, I run out of those that quota, and so I just wait a minute or a little over a minute before I try again. But right, so now we break back into, so this is chapter 2, scene 1, and we'll go through what should happen in that chapter. And so we do this until we completed all the chapters and all the scenes. And so in this way, we are guaranteed to get all of the scenes. We are slightly more likely to get them at the length that we want. And we're more likely to have them be consistent and maintain that continuity. So we're done, right? Well, now we need to actually finish the story. And one thing that you always want, right, is some sort of check on the quality of the story, or the quality of what's been produced, right? We talk about this all the time. You want someone to check the result at the end. Well, again, these stories are fairly long, fairly complex. I don't know that everyone wants to spend the time to read it, although you definitely want to spend the time to read the draft, although you can certainly do that. So what I implemented was just a critiquing system. Right, so I produced prompts for a number of critics who take in the story and assess its quality. Now, here's a critic on continuity. And so this critic's only job is to read the novel and assess the continuity between scenes of the novel in general. And I also have, close that one up. I also have one for entertainment. So what's the entertainment value of this novel? Because again, you're not writing, you don't want at least to write a boring novel. So what do we need for this? So here's what it produces, right? So continuity analysis of recent events. The story maintains strong continuity through these early scenes, yada yada yada. Consistent progression of discovered items. Each piece connects logically to the previous and advances of the plot. Character knowledge, Sarah's knowledge builds naturally from each scene. So a lot of this information, but maybe more importantly, are any recommendations. So consider creating a detailed timeline of the 2008 events to ensure all historical references are maintained. Track Emily's supernatural knowledge carefully. That's the daughter. Document the exact layout of the mill. So just some recommendations on what you can do to enhance continuity, which is also really important. And I think in the future I'll have a loop back system that might actually incorporate these in an automated way. But we'll see. That might be a bit more engineering than I'm really planning to do. But now let's look at entertainment. And so entertainment is distinct from just continuity. Continuity just says, does the story make sense, more or less. Now we get to, is the story entertaining? And so we have, overall appeal, memorable moments, reader investment, page turner quality, which is always interesting to note. And I think this one actually did give some numbers. I don't know how. Yeah, entertainment metrics, page turner rating, emotional impact score, genre satisfaction, etc. Now again, this is the model evaluating itself, so take with a grain of salt these numbers, but it does at least give some comparative results there. And in addition, there are always recommendations, right? Consider adding more direct confrontations between Sarah and Cole to increase tension. Include more scenes showing town residents' reactions to investigations. So just things that add a bit more color to the world, add a bit more entertainment value. And I have a sort of number of these. So I only sort of produced two for the example, but I think I have like 10. One's on marketability as well. so just these critics are really just designed to evaluate the novel from different perspectives and give you those recommendations. Also something you definitely want. So now we actually have to turn this into a story. So right now this is just a list of text, a list of text and a list of metadata, but we want to export this. And so here's the generative portion that's not generative. We essentially just take all of this text, append it together. We have a book, and I'll show you what that books look like. But what I also noticed in reviewing this is that I won't have the time to read it all the way through. I'm going to need a way to ingest this that doesn't require me to read it all the way through, but I still want to be able to skip through and find key points. And so I said to myself, well, I have all the text. This is maybe a prime candidate for an audiobook. A book that I can listen to at an increased speed and sort of see if everything makes sense. And so that's this next portion here. And this is using Amazon Poly. And I'll also play a bit of what was produced here. Now, one of the key pieces, and this is maybe more technical detail than is needed, and we're already off from generating creative work, but there are some text length limits for Amazon Poly, so I just needed to split this up into either individual scenes or like sub scenes for it to be able to do that, and then I pass it to Poly, and it generates audio for me, and I stitch that audio back together. So this book, actually, now let me here we go. The Things Left Behind. Okay, I just needed to remember that so that I can go and pull up the audio and the text for it. 1 second. Okay, so I pulled up the audiobook version, The Things Left Behind. It is roughly about 2 hours. So a 2-hour narrative. I've gotten things as high as 4, depending on how verbose. Really, one of the things that can determine it as well is how verbose of a personality you choose on the writing front, because that writing style does come through. But let's listen to a bit, and then I'll wrap it up.
The break-in looked routine. Broken glass on old hardwood, empty beer cans. Sarah Winters stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust to the darkness. November came in hard this year. The mill's skeleton threw shadows across Main Street, its ghost written in rust against the morning sky. Kids again, Chen said. He kicked an empty can. It rattled across the floor. Hollow sound in a hollow room. Third one this month. Sarah stepped inside. Her boots left prints in the dust. The place still had its old bank smell.
Okay, I think that was enough for what we're after. But as you see here, so this is a well, at least from the audio that you heard, it's a novel you can then listen to yourself and or sort of finish and go through all the polishing to take that text and turn it into an actual book. So there's still a lot of things left to do if you wanted to actually put this, or I would be comfortable just letting this thing run wild. But this is the beginning of how you can create sort of really long work using these generative models. So with that, I'll make the notebook and instructions available. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Would love to see them. And with that, have a great day. Thanks.